one of the things we haven't got, I think, is the total number of deals done in terms of protective certificate issued, PIAs and DSAs. Mr. O'Connor, do you have, you said there's over 100 protective certificates have now been issued. I think I heard that there are 11 PIAs now being signed off. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how many DSAs?
10.
Okay.
And 56 debt relief notes.
And 56 debt relief notices. So if we...
and then in terms of protective notices, over 100. But as I would point out, that even today, there's 12 cases before various circuit courts that are likely to produce new cases. So as I look in terms of what visibility we have, I would be, comfortable that the numbers are significantly increasing week by week.
So the two numbers that are relevant to the mortgage crisis, I think, really are PIAs and DSAs. Do you have an estimate for how many of them you think will be completed by the end of this year?
Well, just as you'd be aware, there's a 70-day lead in from when a protective certificate issues to when an actual arrangement is likely to be in place. So if you were to include those, I would be of the view that we would be looking at a 4-figure sum by the end of the year.
4-figure, so 1,000, 9,000?
I really don't have a view on that because it's a demand-led service. So it's down to how many people go to PIPs. Sure. As to what the number ultimately is likely to be. So but I think, we have been speaking with PIPs around the country, and they are saying that there has been initial engagement with people coming in saying, I've got my problem, can you help? The PIP says, in principle, I believe I can. And they're saying, well, I still want to see others successfully go through before I formally sign on the dotted line. Yeah. So I think as we produce more statistics, or as people become aware of their neighbour successfully going through the process, the engagement will increase.
Okay, so you say 4 figures. So my understanding is that, let's say 2,000 or 3,000.
Okay.
Or is your estimate kind of low thousands or high thousands? But it's
very it is just so difficult to give you an accurate figure. I would have thought the numbers would be higher today than they are. But that's notwithstanding the fact that there are probably along the lines of the experience of other jurisdictions. Sure. But I would have been of the view, given the backlog of cases, or the perceived backlog, that we wouldn't have had that slow run-in. So it's very difficult to say, and I suppose I just don't have an actual number.
Can I just to help is about approximately 200 to date, about 194 between all the various categories, will be the total sum at this moment in time, which is 4 months into the year. Would that be correct?
Sorry, in terms of completed cases, you're close to 100?
In terms of all cases, we'll say between protective notices and all the various, roughly about 194, 112 protective notices, debt relief notice 56, debt service notices, debt settlement notices 10, but roughly about 200. So just in that context, there's only 200 to date.
And over 600 cases in draft form.
Which is 4 months. Which is 4 months into the year. Sorry, time.
Thanks, Chair. So let's say 4,000 by the end of the year, either in train or completed, PIAs or DSAs, which are the two that are relevant to the mortgage crisis, which is what the committee does that seem like a reasonable estimate to you? Notwithstanding everything you've said.
For the purposes of the discussion, yes.
About 4,000. Okay, so here's my problem. I know you and your team are doing the very best you can with the legislation that you've been given, and I would prefer that number to be bigger, because for all of the flaws that I think the insolvency legislation has, I think it is nonetheless a superior mechanism to what we're seeing in the voluntary arrangements. And the reason I say that is this: the spirit of the insolvency legislation, which obviously some banks have explicitly said they're trying to avoid, for me is two things. One is that families get to stay in their homes where possible. And two, this is a genuine restart or recovery from unsustainable debt. Right? Would you agree with that?
I would agree completely.
My problem with the voluntary arrangements is, I think for a lot of the banks, over 90% of the so-called sustainable restructures actually end up in higher payments being made over the lifetime of the debt, right? So we have the figures in from the banks. For Bank of Ireland, as an example, from the figures I saw, it's well over 90%. So term extensions increase total payments, interest only increases total payments, recapitalisation of arrears increases total payments, and so on and so forth. And then we have Bank of Ireland's pretend split mortgage, where they actually charge you the full amount on the shelved portion. That to me is not a sustainable solution to a debt crisis. That to me is an extend and pretend solution to a debt crisis. So here is my big concern. I think I have no doubt that you and your team are doing your best. But if we look at all mortgages in arrears, there's 176,000, right? So that's buy-to-let and owner-occupier arrears, 176,000. And if we take your figure of, say, 4,000, that gives us just over 2%. So about 1 in 50 of the mortgages that are in arrears would come through what I think is a good process. Now, the government target is for that arrears figure essentially to go to zero by the end of this year. The banks are ahead of those targets because they'll be financially penalised by the central bank, right? So the legislation is probably not bad legislation, notwithstanding some things I would change, for a business as usual economy. But I think it's utterly flawed legislation. And therefore, I think the very important task you have in terms of dealing with the crisis, not in dealing with business as usual for the next 10, 20 years in the country, I think you have an impossible task. Because by the end of the year, the banks are going to have forced through voluntary arrangements, which are not remotely sustainable, but they're allowed to define what sustainable is. The central bank is utterly complicit in allowing them to do this. So they're going to get away with it. And therefore, about 1 in 50 of the restructures are going to come through your service, which from a national perspective, from a national debt recovery perspective, is useless. Right? It's great for that 2% because I think they'll have superior solutions to what the banks are voluntarily offering, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. And so in that context, is there anything you think can be done now, that can be done this year, so that we can increase that 2% to a much higher level?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would agree we should be trying to achieve as high a number as we can, and I think those availing of the ISI solutions result in greater transparency for all of the stakeholders involved, a holistic solution, because on occasions the voluntary solutions that maybe banks are offering may only be to solve the mortgage problem, but there could be other credit union loans, credit card loans and so on that need to be dealt with, and there are advantages in availing of the ISI services. That's not to say that people shouldn't try and solve their problems short of the ISI, but I would agree with the broad thrust of your statement. In terms of what we can do to try and get that number as high as possible by the end of the year, the first thing we can do is have an information campaign again. We had one this time last year when we were launching, and we tried to produce as many case studies and guides as possible. We wanted to actually have a few cases successfully through the system before we engaged in a further round of information, because I think it's important that we're able to say, look, here's Joe, he went through successfully, and this is now his situation. And we're able to do that now. So what we are planning to do, and this is in consultation with a number of stakeholders, including Citizens Information Bureau and others, is to have a number of information sessions, which would be light in terms of presentation, maybe only half an hour or an hour explaining the options, but then say, scattered around this room are a dozen or so local PIPs, a number of people from the MAB's offices, a number of people from Chris's division around bankruptcy, as well as ISI, and sit down and have a face-to-face 10, 15-minute conversation this evening with these people, just to tease out maybe your initial queries, and then that might lead to people actually formally meeting with the PIP or whomever it might be. So that's one thing in terms of information. The second thing then is the protocol, and I can't state the importance of the protocol, because it is moving what is a blockage in the system, because it is going to smooth out and make more efficient the entire process, and we are very close to publishing that. I would be hopeful that we will publish it during the month of May, and I think that will encourage PIPs, because they now say, well, actually I have far greater confidence that the cases I'm taking on will successfully go through the system. It should help creditors, because they say, well, now the goalposts aren't moving from one case to another that comes before me. I know what it is, broadly speaking, that's going to come forward, and I can focus on the commercial proposal. And it also helps debtors, because they know, again, where the playing posts are. They're fixed now, and they know what it is they're signing up to. So there's a lot more clarity brought to the situation.
And just in the interest of time, so the information campaign, the protocol, is there anything else, any other big ticket items?
I think they're the main two things, but it's certainly open to any suggestions that this committee might have in terms of what we might do.
Can I ask then, the figure of 4,000, now we accept it might be 2,000, it might be 1,000, it might be 8,000, but we're using 4,000. Does that estimate already include the information campaign and the protocols?
That number isn't a scientific number that we've calculated to stand over, so I don't have a definite number.
Let me rephrase the question. When we talk about this 4,000 figure, accepting it's a range, do you think the protocol and the information campaign may bring it up to 10, 20, 30, 40,000?
I don't think you're going to be getting into double five-figure sums this calendar year.
No, neither do I. I think the protocol and the information campaign are rightly already figured into because they're things you're already planning on doing. And therefore, when you're talking about your estimate for the end of the year, it is right and proper that you would include them. So here's my question, right? 4,000 isn't enough. It's great for those 4,000 or whatever it is. I want it to be 40, 50, 60, 70,000. And the clock is ticking. There's no point us having a great process in place in February of 2015, because the banks will have forced through an awful lot of absolute dross dressed up as sustainable solutions. Is there anything
which will not prevent debtors in those situations availing of PIP services?
Yeah, no, I accept that. I accept that. But is there anything, and maybe Mr. Lehane, you'd have an opinion as well on this, because the reality is, you've been asked by several members of the committee what mechanisms you referred to. So I think it was on page 5, you said, if the banks don't play ball, and they've explicitly stated that they're not going to play ball, and we know they have never played ball, some of them, there are mechanisms. The only mechanism I've heard is insolvency. So can I ask you both the following question? If we wanted to be far more ambitious, and we wanted to have not 4,000, but 40,000 through by the end of the year, because that's the crisis. You know, 4,000 is business as usual, more or less. We're dealing with a crisis. How would we move it from 4,000 to 40,000 by the end of the year?
Well, I mean, in terms of what the numbers are at the moment, a number of PIPs are telling us that they have hundreds of cases on their books, which will be translating into cases in the ISI in the near future. I only have to point to the IMHO and their initiative with Grant Thornton, where they have suggested that they will have a 4-figure sum for us in the coming months in terms of cases that they have. So again, it's a slow start, but it is building. I think in terms of the information campaign, it'll be important, and the very fact that people are able to say, I have done this successfully.
Yeah, I'm sorry to cut across. It's just in the interest of time. Yeah. You're staying within your own parameters. I'm asking you to think outside of those parameters. I'm saying to you, if I was the Minister for Finance and I came and I said, Lorcan, you got to hit 40,000 by the end of the year. You tell me what you need, and we'll push it through in legislation or in funding or in tackling the banks or in giving the central bank new powers or whatever it is. If Minister Noonan came to you and said, I don't want 4,000, I want 40,000, what would that take?
I think the important thing to remember is that it is a demand-led service. So we are open. There are over 100 PIPs around the country. They have the capacity. So it is simply down to ensuring that there is engagement and confidence within the debtors that actually they know what their options are and they feel comfortable to apply.
Can I ask,
So
are you...
I think it is
I'm
very
just-
much at the debtor level.
I'm going to just, sir, Mr. Lehane, just before we go to Mr. O'Connor, I'm just going to push you here, because I don't know whether or not you can't think of anything, because every member of this committee could probably tell you two or three things straight away. If you can't or you're reluctant to, can you just tell me which of those it is? Can you genuinely not think of anything that would increase, that would double, treble, quadruple the thing? Or are you reluctant? Do you feel you're straying into policy areas?
Well, I mean, it is not the role of the ISI to move into policy areas, but do I think there's a policy initiative or any other initiative that will see a 3 or a fourfold increase by the end of the year? I have difficulty in seeing what that might be, but certainly open to any suggestions that the committee might have.
Mr. Lehane. And sorry, Chair, your previous chair took up a bit of time, so if I could get you back, I'd appreciate it. Sorry, Mr. Lehane.
Yes.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Well, to answer from the bankruptcy perspective, and what you describe as dross deals should be bankruptcy. I mean, within this committee, there is almost, you're caught up in the stigma of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a perfect solution. I see people who've taken equity releases, they're in houses and mortgages, they're completely unsustainable. But you're talking about the distress and the pain, they're trying the impossible. Why? Because they've got a view that if I go bankrupt, I'm a failure. Whereas in America, it's a badge of honour to go on, and we've heard of the people who visited Ireland recently buying castles, who were spectacularly successful after going to bankruptcy. And if we can truly, even within this committee, lose the stigma, in Northern Ireland it's 1,500. The last couple of years it's seen 50,000 bankruptcies. All of these measures, IVAs, they're working perfectly, they've been there for years, still 50,000 bankruptcies. So within, and the discussion over losing the family home and how many have lost, and that's a terrible thing. No, it's not. For those people, they've actually got out from an incredible burden that has been impossible to deal with, and they haven't faced up to the reality, and they've gone bankrupt. And I've dealt with people, and I've commented on in a talk, and then it was commented in the paper. The day they push that bankruptcy button, it's my problem. I deal with their issues. It is stressful. I'm dealing with every commercial decision that person has. It's gone. It's finished. They're off the picture. They're in commercial actions. Some of the people have gone bankrupt and they're in court on the Wednesday. I had to run, jump, deal with those issues and bring a reality to the creditors that that's it. This person is bankrupt, it's gone. That release has come and they are now moving beyond. And then, as I've said, when it comes to even to the family home, in some of those cases, it's all those other commitments are gone. And the family home may well actually be now affordable. So stop thinking necessarily that bankruptcy is not something that should always be done. It's the fourth option. It is a valid option and people should avail of it more. And to come, all those figures that you mentioned with Lorcan, we're all on Lorcan's side of the house. We have, 82 bankruptcies at the moment. If we had anything like Northern Ireland, we would be greatly adding to the solution. But we're not, because people still have this stigma.
Can I ask as my final question then, if I may, Chair? Mr. Lehane, if there are 1, 2 or 3 things that you would do to increase the credibility of the threat, right? So, for example, reduce it from 3 years to 2 years. For example, move the income protection order from maximum of 5 to maximum of 2, or whatever. You're the expert in this country. What 1, 2, or 3 policy changes would you make, potentially time-bound, 2 or 3 years, to deal with the crisis, in order to increase the potency of 2 things: the making going through it less punitive, and/or making it a more credible threat so that people can deal on Mr. O'Connor's side or voluntarily? What would you change?
Well, Lorcan and I are in the Insolvency Regulators Association, and internationally, 3 years compares very well. So would I put it down to 3 years? In talking to individuals, even with the UK Insolvency Service, would I put it down to 1? Which is kind of, is this going to be the solution? Does that necessarily mean that people are going to be availing of bankruptcy quicker? That is a possibility. People might regard it as more favourable. Do I think that Internationally, people have regarded 1 year as acceptable. I personally would stick with the 3 years. Within my own policy on the income payment orders, I'm fair to people. So while you believe it could have been 8, I'm saying it could be 2, could be 3, depending on what their capacity. So I believe I'm applying the processes, but I do think people really need, and I do think the roadshow that we'll do with Lorcan, where we get out there and we explain to people what exactly bankruptcy is. It has in the past been operated as almost like a criminal offence. The more people down the road avail of it and people see the release. So if you're asking me what solutions, I do think there's a huge campaign to be got out there.
And
Everywhere in the world,
question just
it should be
specifically
a valid solution.
Thank you very much for that. The question specifically was, though, what would you change? There are levers that can be pulled all over the legislation. If there are 1 or 2 of those levers that you said, yeah, if you guys want to make this more accessible, more of a credible threat, thanks, Chair, it's this one and this one. What would you change first?
Well, in relation to changing bankruptcy, if you want an instant solution that's going to be getting bankruptcy more, you could take it down to 1 year. Personally, looking at international practice, I wouldn't personally recommend that. And I do think people, an information campaign, and really, I don't have another legal solution, because I know within the bankruptcy process we operated and we applied the reasonable living expense guidelines in a very fair manner to try and make it as easy as possible for people. So I don't have a legal solution. I have a lot of other tampering with the Bankruptcy Act. It can take the official assignee out, bring more private trustees in. In England, that is the practice. There's more bankruptcies, maybe that's one way. In my view, that possibly could make it more expensive for individuals. So I personally believe operating the bankruptcy process in an absolute fair and transparent manner and destigmatising it, it's the biggest thing we can possibly do.